Everyone's afraid of something. The dentist, taxes, the dark, even broccoli. Yuck. We all have something that keeps us up at night. And honestly, some things are scary. The good news is that with God, we don't have to be as afraid. With God on our side, we can fear less.
I don't know exactly when it happened, but at some point in my early 30s, I started to have anxieties about flying. The first time I felt it, I was pretty baffled. I'd flown countless times without any concern or issue. But suddenly, the thought of getting on a plane was overwhelming for me. Thankfully, those fears have largely gone away, and I have no issue getting on planes now. But for several years, I would do just about anything to avoid getting on one. Then, in 2011, I had the chance to be on a Swedish reality television show called Allt för Sverige, which in English means everything for Sweden. The concept of the show is to bring 10 Americans of Swedish descent to their ancestral homeland where they learn the story of their family history while competing in amazing race-type competitions, with the winner getting a reunion with their Swedish family. This will not come as a shock to you, but you can't drive to Sweden. So I had a choice. Either overcome my fear of flying or miss out on this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I decided to go. That said, as the time for departure neared, my fear started to escalate. Thankfully, I have a very patient and supportive spouse. She not only put up with me during all of that, but she also reassured me and gave me the encouragement I needed to get on the plane. About 10 minutes into the flight, the pilot announced that there was a fuel leak in one of the engines, creating a risk of fire. So they were turning the plane around and, as he said, making a steep and rapid descent back to Louisville, which it was. I took this picture shortly after we landed. I was pretty shaken up, so I called Carrie and said something like, "I'm not sure what to do. I'm kind of freaking out." Now, the way she tells the story, what followed was out of her own self-preservation. It was hard enough to get me on the plane the first time, and she wasn't about to go through all of that again. But I think there was something more caring to it than that. Whatever the motivation, she calmly and clearly said to me, "What you are going to do is hang up the phone, contact the airline, and get on another flight. Call me back after you've done that." So that's what I did, getting the last seat on a flight to Detroit that would get me on a connecting flight overseas. But get this, when I got to Detroit and was checking into my next flight, the ticket agent asked about my last flight, and I told her what happened. Her response? "Oh, so that was your first emergency landing ever?" Not helpful. Not helpful at all. Whether it is about flying or something else, we all have fears. Some of the fears we face are rational. There are things in this world and in our lives that threaten us. But some of our fears are not so rational, and we probably pay too much attention to them. Either way, every single one of us has and will experience fear or anxiety about something. Some of us will experience more than others, some of us less, but we will all experience it. And because of all the things going on in our world right now, there seems to be a heightened sense of fear and anxiety floating around for sure. What's interesting about our current levels of heightened fear is that in spite of all that is going on, we are living in one of the safest and most prosperous eras in human history. In some ways, we have less to be afraid of now than most generations that have come before us. And yet, rates of fear and anxiety are rising. In his book, The Science of Fear, Daniel Gardner put it this way: "We are the healthiest, wealthiest, and longest lived people in history, and we are increasingly afraid. This is one of the great paradoxes of our time. While fear is not always a bad thing, there is no doubt that sometimes it gets the best of us. And instead of saving our lives, it keeps us from living and appreciating the life that we have been given. Over the next several weeks, we are going to talk about ways we can deal with fear. The purpose of this series is not to tell you how to get rid of every fear you may have. That is not realistic. I don't care how deep your faith is, there will be times that you are afraid. Instead, we are going to talk about how we can fear less, how we can reduce our fears enough that they won't get in the way of us living a more abundant life. A primary resource for this journey will be this book by Adam Hamilton, Unafraid: Living with Courage and Hope in Uncertain Times. If you find that this topic speaks to you and you want to dig in a little deeper, I encourage you to read the book. Really good stuff. The first thing I want to say about fear is that it is not always a bad thing. In fact, the ability to experience fear is part of how we are made, and it is essential for our survival. Now, this is an oversimplification, but there are basically two ways our body and mind work together when it comes to fear. The first is that initial reaction we have when something threatens us. Often called the fight or flight response, this is that biological thing that kicks in when we experience a threat. That response starts in our brain at a place called the amygdala. Acting as an early warning system, the amygdala takes in information through our senses and is constantly looking for threats. When it senses something that could be a danger, it goes into action by causing the body to react in ways meant to help us survive. Increasing adrenaline, increasing heart rate, and giving us a heightened sensitivity to external stimulus. This response can happen so fast that we aren't always aware of it kicking in, and we can't always control it. It has to act faster than we can think in order to help us react as quickly as possible. The problem is that sometimes the amygdala sends a false alarm. It senses something happening around us that it perceives as a threat that really isn't, triggering that protective response. This can cause feelings of fear and anxiety that are out of proportion to any actual danger we may be facing. For some people, this can become a real struggle. About 40 million Americans 18 and over live with some kind of anxiety disorder, making it the most common mental health struggle in our nation. Fortunately, there are treatments that can help, but even with treatment, this can be a very challenging condition. If you've lived through or are living with that kind of anxiety, you know how difficult it can be. If you have never struggled with anxiety, I want to encourage you to be gentle toward those who do. While it may be hard for you to understand, the effects of anxiety are very real, and they can be so frightening for those who experience it. While the amygdala helps us respond to immediate threats, our ability to foresee possible future threats helps us to take steps to minimize those risks. For example, when we get into a car, we know there might be an accident, so we put on our seatbelt. On cold days, we dress appropriately, or at least most of us do. There's always that one person wearing shorts, no matter the temperature. You know who you are. We stock our homes with medicine that we might need for a future illness. We try to create emergency funds for future use. The threats we are preparing for may never happen, but if they do, our preparation puts us in a much better place to deal with them. But again, sometimes our imagination can get the best of us. We can find ourselves fearing future events that may never happen. For some of us, those worries and fears keep us up at night and cause us to be overly anxious about the future. Bottom line here is that the ability to fear is a good thing. We need it to survive. At the same time, sometimes our fears get the best of us, and instead of keeping us alive, they keep us from experiencing the fullness of life. Finding the balance between these two things is key to fearing less and living more abundantly. One of the things that can help us find that balance is our faith. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that if you have enough faith, you will never be afraid. That is magical thinking, and it is not realistic or helpful. What I am saying is that faith can help keep us grounded during moments or seasons of fear and anxiety. While it may not solve every problem or take away every fear, our faith can provide us with both the reassurance and the confidence we need to walk through even the darkest of valleys. For example, Scripture tells us there was a time when King David was fleeing for his life and facing almost certain death. In the midst of that very real fear, he wrote these words: "Be merciful to me, my God, for my enemies are in hot pursuit. All day long they press their attack. My adversaries pursue me all day long. In their pride, many are attacking me. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust and am not afraid. What can mere mortals do to me?" Now, David's fears were well justified, and I'm sure his faith did not relieve all his fears. But it did serve as a reminder that he could find comfort in the promises of God. And they remind us that we can too. While it may not magically solve every problem, faith can be a tremendous source of comfort and strength when we are experiencing fear. That fact will be an important part of this series. But we will also talk a lot about non-faith-based things we can do, tangible, real actions we can take to help us fear less and find a more abundant life. While there are several fears we could talk about in this series, we're going to address some of the most prevalent ones, like fears of failure or disappointing others, the fear of loneliness, the fear of financial hardship, the fear of getting sick, and the fear of dying. Even if your fears are centered on other things, our exploration of these topics will provide some insight into how you can face the other things in life that may cause fear or anxiety. As for my trip to Sweden, after the initial excitement, I got there without any other issue and ended up having the experience of a lifetime. There were moments I had to breathe deep, especially when we flew north of the Arctic Circle, eventually getting on helicopters that took us into a remote village where we lived for several days and where I learned how to lasso reindeer, which was really cool. And of course, I had to fly back home. But it was all worth it. In the end, I won the competition and had a reunion with my Swedish family. To say that the trip changed my life really is an understatement. Not only did I learn a lot about my family history, but I also developed relationships with my Swedish relatives that continue today. We ended up traveling back there twice in the few years after my experience, each of those trips bringing experiences and memories for which I am so grateful. And while I no longer have those fears about flying, our trips back at that time were not easy for me. I had to deal with my anxieties and fears every time. But here's the thing, while those fears didn't go away, I was able to get to the place where I feared less. And that was enough. My hope is that whatever fears you may have, no matter how large or small, no matter how rational or seemingly irrational, that you too will discover some ways to fear less and live more. Amen.